Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Live with the Hagley Historian. I am Lucas Clawson, historian at Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. This is coming to you as part of our Hagley from Home initiative. Hagley is closed to staff and visitors at the moment due to the COVID-19 shutdown, so we are bringing Hagley to you. I am coming to you live from my home here in Wilmington, Delaware. And as always, my production assistant and supervisor, Lucian, is here behind me. He's passed out having a good snooze. It was a long night of supervising me, getting ready for a couple of presentations that are happening today in addition to this one. So thank you all for joining me today. We're going to do a follow-up to last week's talk on Samuel Francis DuPont and the Civil War Navy. And this one is going to be a little more specific about the ironclads, the use of ironclads in the Navy. And without further ado, let's jump right in. Samuel Francis DuPont and ironclads. I am going to talk about this today because this is a defining thing for Samuel Francis DuPont. He had a long career in the U.S. Navy that started in 1815. He first went to sea in 1817, served through the Mexican-American War, a lot of service in the North Atlantic, South Atlantic, around the world. Witnessed some of the bombardments in the Second Opium War, had a lot of service by the time we came to the Civil War. He was a key figure in the U.S. Navy during that time, but ironclads are the big crux for him. This was the culmination in a lot of ways of his career, and the thing that really kind of wrecked things for him, which we'll get into today. So to give you a quick reminder, that when the Civil War started, he was immediately tapped to be a part of the United States Navy Blockade Board, part of General Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan for figuring out how to blockade and strangle out the Confederate States. So he is one of the main people who devised the strategy for the United States Navy for blockading the southern coast. And he received command of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, whose jurisdiction went from the border of North and South Carolina to the southern tip of Florida. This was considered a pretty important command because it included Charleston, South Carolina, which was seen as the hotbed of the Confederacy, the place where secession started in December 1860, but then also Fernandina in Florida, which was a major port on the Florida coast during that time, and also Savannah, Georgia. He received appointment to be head of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron in September of 1861, and stayed there until July of 1863, so his service covered a long period of time. But he's one of the first commanders of the U.S. Navy to use squadrons of ironclad vessels in combat, and that's why we're going to get into this today. But let's start a little bit further back and define what is an ironclad. What is an ironclad vessel? So in the 19th century, it was any sort of ship or a vessel with armor. It's literally clad or covered in iron, that today we tend to think about like the Monitor and the Merrimack, which I'll talk about in a bit. But for the purposes of this talk, it can mean any kind of vessel with an iron covering. It could be a wood-hulled ship with iron covering over some pieces of it, like to cover the guns or the engineering spaces, magazines where ammunition is stored, that sort of thing, or an iron-hulled ship that had specifically armored points, or a purpose-built ship of a novel design. So this means something completely new and radical, which ends up happening during the American Civil War. Now, what got the American Navy thinking about this was not only the secession crisis, which started in December of 1860, and thinking about the real possibility of going to war, but it's a counter, in part, to this ship, that in 1860, France commissioned the Gloire, which was an ironclad vessel. It was a wooden-hulled ship that had armor in front of its guns, in front of its engineering spaces. This was a complete game changer for Europe because this was the first nation, the first time to have such an armored ship. This could mean the balance of power, naval power, would be shifted in a big way, that Great Britain had controlled the seas throughout the 18th and 19th century, and they wanted to keep control of the seas. So in response to the Gloire, Great Britain commissioned in 1860 the HMS Warrior, which is a museum ship in Portsmouth in the United Kingdom. You can go visit it today. And the HMS Black Prince in 1861. Both of these are traditional-looking ships. They were iron-hulled vessels that had armor plating over the engineering spaces and in front of the guns, and powerful new guns. So the United States is seeing this and thinking about it in a big way. That Europe is something that they're always keeping their eyes on. And why this was a big deal as you're going in to the American Civil War is that you don't know who's going to go for what side. One of the worries for the United States was that both France and Great Britain would side with the Confederacy and put army power and navy power to helping the Confederacy out. So the United States is really worried about this. The U.S. Navy is really worried about these ironclad vessels because not only could this tip the balance of power in Europe, it could tip the balance of power around the world. This was even more prominent for the United States on account of the Trent affair when the USS San Giacomo stopped the Royal Mail steamer Trent on November 8, 1861, and removed two Confederate diplomats on their way to Great Britain. This caused a tremendous international incident because Wright had the United States to stop a British ship, which was neutral in the American Civil War, and take people off, especially diplomats. That Queen Victoria's court was really unhappy about this, and the United States had to make a formal apology for taking these guys off and release them to be able to eventually go to the United Kingdom in order to resolve this diplomatic affair. But there's a lot of worry going on in the United States about what navies on the other side of the ocean are doing, again, particularly Britain and France. Adding to these worries as the Civil War got rolling, they had rumors in 1861 that the former USS Merrimack, which was in the Norfolk Navy Yard when the Civil War began, the U.S. Navy burned it to the waterline and destroyed many of its internal systems and sank it at Norfolk to keep the Confederates from getting it. But the Confederates raised the ship and recommissioned it, the CSS Virginia, and made it into an ironclad ram, an ironclad vessel. So they cut it down right to the waterline, and on top of it built an armored casemate. So this was a thick wooden structure with iron armor over the top and a heavy ram on the front, which meant this ship could not only with firepower overcome other ships, but literally ram right into another ship and tear the thing apart. And a wooden-hulled ship wouldn't stand a chance against something like this. So the U.S. Navy's really worried about what's going on in the Confederacy during this time as well. So this leads the Navy and Congress to push for what was called the Ironclad Board. So they were able to get Congressional Appropriations to be able to allocate money to build new ships, new ironclad vessels. And this happens in August 1861, and led by the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Gustavus Fox, and the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles. They're the two leading the charge. They put together a board of U.S. Navy officers and Marine constructors to evaluate designs and to think about ships that the U.S. Navy could build and put into service to combat not only France and Britain's ironclad vessels, but what was being built in the Confederacy. So what do you do with an ironclad? How do you think about an ironclad? 17 designs were submitted whenever the board put out the idea. 3 were chosen as finalists. One of the huge problems in thinking about building and dealing with ironclad vessels is what do you do with an ironclad vessel? The U.S. Navy didn't have a comprehensive strategy for this. This is something so new, something so radical. It's not like thinking of a frigate, a large-scale vessel that cruises, waves the flag in other waters, or something like a gunboat, which is a smaller ship which can go up streams. It has a shallow draft, meaning it can go in shallow water. You can go up rivers and streams and bombard forts and land positions, things like that. But an ironclad vessel, how do you deal with it? Do you want something that can go to sea? Do you want something that can work inland waters? How does all that go? So these are some of the uncertainties that the Navy's thinking about when they're evaluating these designs. So this is what goes into the thinking with the 3 designs which got chosen as finalists by the Ironclad Board. The first was the USS Galena, commissioned into the U.S. Navy in April 1862, built at the Bushnell shipyard in Mystic, Connecticut. This was not really that much of a novel design. It was a traditional ship that had iron armor, interlocking armor, so it was beams of iron which locked together, backed with India rubber. It was made to look like a traditional ship. It could be rigged to sail, or in the configuration like you see in this drawing, it was made to go completely under steam power. In putting this ship into combat in the James River and on the Potomac River against Confederate positions, they found that its armor scheme was not the greatest. So this is a picture of the USS Galena. The two red arrows you see at bottom are Confederate shells stuck in the side of the USS Galena. That the armor proved pretty ineffective, especially against heavy guns that forts could shoot at these ships. That the USS Galena's design was considered pretty ineffective. So what the U.S. Navy ended up doing was putting the Galena into a shipyard and completely refitting it as just a wooden-hulled vessel. So they took all the ironcladding off the outside, refit it as a wooden vessel, and used it as a gunboat for the rest of the war. So the USS Galena out of the picture. The next design was the USS New Ironsides, commissioned into the U.S. Navy in May 1862, built by the Cramp and Sons shipyard in Philadelphia. Just like last week, we have emergency vehicles going by. I'll hold on a second and let it clear out. Okay, the USS New Ironsides, built by Cramp and Sons in Philadelphia. This one was modeled more along the lines of the French Gloire and the HMS Warrior and Black Prince. This was a regular ship. It was made more like a regular ship. You could rig it for sails, or you could take the spars masts off, use it under steam power. It was what was called a case-mated ironclad. So it's just a ship that sits up out of the water, and it has a traditional gun deck like you see on ships of that period. So they had iron shutters that were over the front of the guns that could open up, allow the gun to run out and fire. You pull it back in, close the shutters down. That way you can protect the guns and gun crews from incoming fire. This one was the least radical of the designs that the U.S. Navy evaluated and put into service. It ended up becoming a pretty powerful ship. It could mount heavy guns. It could go out to sea. It could work not so much really close inland, but it ended up becoming a pretty valuable ship. But there was only one of them made. It's not the design that won out in the end. The one that did, and the one that everyone is probably familiar with if you've heard anything about Civil War Navy history, the USS Monitor. Commissioned in February 1862. February was important because it went into commission first, and that's one of the reasons why it ended up getting adopted. Built by the Continental Iron Works in Brooklyn, New York. This was the most radical of all the designs, the biggest mind bender, if you will, for people in the U.S. Navy. It was built to be more or less a raft with a circular revolving turret on the top that mounted two guns. And a lot of the descriptions of the period called it a raft with a cheese box sitting on the top. It was something that was completely new and different, that it was a wooden frame ship with iron cladding over the outside and iron armor over the deck, over the turret itself, around key parts of the ship. That no one had ever seen anything like this before. This was the brainchild of John Ericsson, a Swedish-American naval designer, and quite a controversial figure. That he didn't want to get into naval design during the American Civil War. He had a bad taste in his mouth, if you will, through a mishap with the USS Princeton in the 1840s, where a gun of his design exploded, killing a couple of members of the presidential cabinet, and getting raked over the coals by the Navy Department. Ended up not getting paid for the work that he had done for the Navy Department up to that time. So he wasn't, although he had made a lot of innovative designs for the marine industry, like screw propellers for steamships and other things, he didn't really want to work for the Navy, but some of his friends talked him into submitting a design. He also, and this is a really important point to make too, had some pretty powerful friends in the state of New York and New York City that lobbied for him in Congress. So one of the big reasons his design won out was not only could they deliver it quickly, but he had some pretty powerful people advocating for him through the Senate, through the U.S. House, to be able to push appropriations through, get this finally approved to be the design that the U.S. Navy used. So John Ericsson's design for the USS Monitor, that's where the U.S. Navy really landed with all this. The first trial of the USS Monitor was the Battle of Hampton Roads, Virginia, on March 8th and 9th, 1862. And this is the famous battle, the Monitor versus the Merrimack, or the Monitor versus Virginia, depending upon which name you want to use for the Confederate ship. That on March 8th, the CSS Virginia sailed out into Hampton Roads and into Norfolk, sunk two heavy U.S. frigates, and made a complete mess of everything. The USS Monitor came just in the nick of time on March 9th, just as the Virginia was sailing out to try to finish off what was left of the U.S. Navy blockading force and fleet at Hampton Roads, in sails the Monitor and fights the Virginia to a stalemate. That although the Virginia mounted heavier guns set higher in the water, it was a terrible ship to be able to steer, that they could barely steer the thing. It was hard to aim the guns. The Monitor was a little more flexible but really slow. One of the problems with the turret is it's hard to move it. It moves really slowly and you've only got two guns. But they were able to fight each other to a stalemate. And in the end, although the battle was a draw, it ended up being in some ways a strategic victory for the United States Navy because they stopped this ironclad menace, the CSS Virginia, stopped the further destruction of ships at Hampton Roads in and around Norfolk, Virginia. But it also is proof of concept. It showed that this design, the Monitor design, to a point would work. So this was an important thing. And that's why the Navy decided to keep rolling with the Erickson designed ships. They realized that there were some problems. It was really small, that the Monitor was a small ship, hard to deal with, so they changed a few things and made the technological improvement of the USS Passaic, which was commissioned in November 1862, and the Passaic class monitors. And some of the improvements that were put into these ships were that they were made wider, they were made longer, that way they would be a little more stable. They did sit low in the water, which was part of the design. The turrets were made a little bigger, made to handle larger guns. But then the wheelhouse, which is the point from where you steer the ship, if you look at the USS Monitor, which is in the foreground, there's a little box that sits on the deck just in front of the turret. That was the wheelhouse. You sit so low that you can't really see. So the change for the Passaic class Monitor was to take the wheelhouse off the deck and put it on top of the turret. That way you could actually see out. So the U.S. Navy ended up commissioning 10 of these, 10 Passaic class monitors, that they put all of their time and effort into building these things because they felt like this was the technological improvement which was going to be able to revolutionize things for the Navy and help the Navy push into Confederate ports, Confederate harbors, completely dash the Confederates' hopes for any kind of naval supremacy on the southern coast. So Gustavus Fox and Gideon Welles came up with a plan. They wanted to capture Charleston, South Carolina in a bad way, and they wanted to do it with an all-ironclad force, with just the U.S. Navy. One of the things that the two of these guys did not like was cooperating with the Army on joint operations. And the Civil War proved why that was so important, to work with both the Army and the Navy. Where the forces, the U.S. Armed Forces landed, so to speak, was with doing joint action, working together on capturing forts, cities, any kind of places like that. But in the beginning of the war, they didn't want to do this. That the Navy wanted the prestige of being able to take Charleston all by itself. And they wanted to do this in part because of Samuel Francis DuPont himself and the Battle of Port Royal in South Carolina, which he took with an all-Navy force on November 7th, 1861. This was the first victory for Union forces during the American Civil War. The Navy Department, Gideon Welles, Gustavus Fox, pushed on Admiral DuPont as commander of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, of which Charleston was in his jurisdiction, that they wanted him to capture Charleston with an all-Navy force. They pushed on him, well, you did it before, the Navy did such good work, we want to show the Army and show everybody how great and powerful and wonderful the Navy is, plus we've got this technological magic bullet in these Monitor-type ironclads. But Admiral DuPont was a skeptic on this, that he had been reading everything he could lay his hands on about the Monitor, especially reports of its fight with the CSS Virginia, but more importantly, reports of its work on the James River in Virginia and working up the Potomac River and trying to take out Confederate forts and land positions, which it wasn't so well suited to do. It could help cover small-scale land operations, but it couldn't, they found, put up a pretty heavy volume of fire to be able to take out Confederate forts. So he's a skeptic of whether or not they could take Charleston in this way. He also argued back to the Navy Department that in November 1861, the Confederates weren't ready, that when they're first thinking of this plan in late 1862, early 1863, the Confederates are, that they had had time to train gun crews, to figure out things like how to aim distances in Charleston Harbor and other places, mount really heavy guns. And so this is part of the thinking that he was putting into place, that if we were going to do this, we should have done it in November or December 1861, not December 1862, excuse me, or January 1863. So he's a skeptic of this plan, but thinks, well, maybe the new Passaic-class monitors will do what they say they'll do. So let's try them out. As Passaic-class monitors were available, he decided to put them into service, put them into combat against Fort McAllister in Georgia from January to March of 1863. The idea being that this was a small 8-gun Confederate fort. If we can get ironclads to be able to subdue an 8-gun Confederate fort, then let's see what it'll do against Charleston Harbor. He put one into action. They couldn't take out the fort. Put two into action. They couldn't take out the fort. Put up to 7 ironclads into action, these Passaic-class ironclads into action against Fort McAllister, and they could not subdue an 8-gun earthwork fort off the Georgia coast. So this is making him a little bit more of a skeptic about whether or not these are going to work. So from using them in combat and taking the suggestions of line officers, the people who actually serve inside these ships, work them, use them, he found out that they had several technological problems, things that were going to make them difficult to use. The first was the ordnance, the cannons that go inside them. As first designed, the Passaic-class monitors were supposed to use two 11-inch Dahlgren guns. And the Dahlgren guns were some of the most technologically advanced guns of their day. They were smoothbores and not rifles, but they were meant to fire a hardened projectile meant to punch through any kind of armor, that this was designed to be able to punch through brick, but specifically armor. And these were considered good weapons for ships like this because you weren't shooting at things far away. Shooting at things far away were going to be a problem with a gun like this, but shooting at something up close like you would do in naval combat, typically you're not shooting at something any more than a couple thousand yards away at most during that period. So this was going to be a pretty good deal for ships like that. It was originally designed for two 11-inch Dahlgren guns, but as they were building the Passaic-class monitors, they came out with a 15-inch Dahlgren gun, which means the bore of the gun was 15 inches wide. So if you look at the photograph at the bottom, you'll notice the two different size guns, that there's one that doesn't fit through the gun port and the other one that does. So that's the 11-inch Dahlgren and the 15-inch Dahlgren side by side. Now you can imagine the problems of trying to shoot a gun like this. You can't put it completely out of the gun port, so you have to shoot it from inside the turret itself. So this is a black powder gun. That means there's a lot of spark, a lot of ash, a lot of stuff that goes all over the place whenever you shoot a gun like this. Plus the sound, the concussion, you could possibly knock out or even kill people inside the turret. And plus, one of the advantages of having a turret like this is that you can load the guns from within the turret itself. So the Navy asked the question, can we make the gun port bigger? The answer is no, not without ruining the structural integrity of the turret itself, meaning that if it took a direct hit, it might crumple the turret or destroy it in some way, so they had to leave it alone. The solution to the problem was to build a box that completely covered the muzzle of the 15-inch gun. You had to shoot it from inside the gun port, but you had to cover up the muzzle so whenever you fired, you didn't blow everything back inside the turret itself. You couldn't aim the gun from the gun itself. You had to aim it from the 11-inch gun, which is a tremendous problem in trying to aim the guns of that period. But also in loading this gun, you couldn't load it from inside the turret. You had to load it from outside, so it took away a lot of the advantage of having a turreted ironclad. So whenever these things were in combat, they had to rotate the turret so that the gun ports faced away from your enemy. They had to pull the 11-inch gun completely inside. The gun crew had to get out of the turret, load the gun for the 15-inch gun from the outside, then come back inside the turret, load the 11-inch gun, and then run them both up into battery, which is their shooting position. So this made a really slow rate of fire even slower and reduced a lot of your accuracy on these guns. And so you can imagine the tremendous problem that this would make. Another problem with the turret itself is that you couldn't seal it down to the deck. So whenever the ship was at sea, the deck was always awash, meaning water was always over the top, meaning water was always pouring in to the ship itself. So the turret, and the technological problems that go with it, but not the least of which are the ordnance and the cannons themselves. Another problem with the turret is that the wheelhouse, which sits completely on top, as opposed to the monitor where it sat on deck, the wheelhouse sits on a center spindle. So it's a round piece of steel that goes up through the center of the turret itself. So one of the problems is if this wheelhouse takes a direct hit, it bends, and it can pin the turret in place. So imagine what a terrible technological problem that is. So if it takes that direct hit, that means your turret can't turn. You have to turn the entire ship to aim the guns or use the turret itself. Also, if you look in this photograph, down in the intersection with the turret and the deck, if it takes a direct hit there, it can crumple the armor a little bit, make just enough of a pinch where you could pin the turret in place or lift it up just a little bit so that your turret won't turn. So there's a lot of problems, a lot of vulnerabilities with these turrets. And one of the solutions was to put complete armor plating over the outside of the wheelhouse so that whenever it took a direct hit, it wouldn't bend back and forth. And also put extra armor around the base of the turret itself. They found too that if you didn't put extra armor on the outside of the wheelhouse, because of the riveting patterns, the way the rivets were set inside the iron on the wheelhouse, whenever it took a direct hit, the back ends of the turrets would blow off and be projectiles on the inside of the turret in the wheelhouse. So that is another tremendous problem of the turret itself. So another problem is that these are not so-called blue water vessels. You can't really take them out to sea. The drawing you see here is of a Passaic class Ironclad, a Passaic class Monitor, struggling out in the open water. That in any kind of rough seas, they're tremendously hard to handle. That water comes in everywhere through the turret. That water will come in through the anchor well, so where the anchors go through. Anywhere there's an open space, water comes in. The only time the deck was dry is if you're sitting in calm water and not moving. So you can't take these things to sea. Typically, when they were moved from station to station, another ship had to tow them. They also have incredibly inefficient engines because this is a completely steam-powered vessel, and you have to make an engine small enough to fit within a small hull. They weren't able to make them efficient enough to really go anywhere, so you had to tow them back and forth. So they're not vessels that you can take out to sea. You have to use them in rivers and bays close in and not out at sea where the water could be rough. And something that you may or may not know about these Ironclads, Passaic-class vessels, this drawing is of the USS Passaic. And if you look closely at it, as you're looking at this image, to the left is the front of the ship, to the right is the back of the ship, and you'll notice that the front sits higher in the water than the back. That part of the design of a ship like this is that it has to sit a little cockeyed in the water. That way water will drain. That Erickson knew that you couldn't completely seal up a ship like this. So when water comes in, it has to go into the bilges, go to the back of the ship where it can be pumped out. Any kind of obstructions that get into the bilges means that you throw the weight of the ship itself off. And also whenever you load the ship, because it sat so low in the water, everything was so finely balanced, there wasn't much room for error. So when you take on food, take on ammunition, you have to do it just right. That as an example of this, the USS Weehawken in 1863 sank in a matter of about 30 seconds. And they figured out the problem of this was that ammunition had been loaded incorrectly, in addition to some of the drain holes were plugged. So whenever this ship went down, instantly hit the bottom. The only people that got out were the people on watch on top of the turret. So this was a huge problem for using these vessels. So something that Samuel Francis DuPont had to think about in wanting to put these ships into combat, and also the plan to try to capture Charleston, South Carolina. So as he's evaluating these ships, he's pushing these technological issues back up the food chain that John Erickson himself is not willing to address them in any way, because in his response, my design is perfect, you're using them wrong. And a lot of the people in the engineering department within the Navy didn't want to listen to these ideas because their thought was, well, Erickson's right. We've looked over the plans. These things are great. You line officers just don't know how to use your equipment. So there's a lot of arguments brewing in the run-up to Samuel Francis DuPont's attack on Charleston, South Carolina, and over how these things should be properly used in combat. So we get to the attack on Charleston, that Samuel Francis DuPont is arguing this is maybe not a good idea, let's not do it. The Navy Department pretty much gives him an ultimatum, you need to do this or else. You need to just suck it up and run in there and attack. So he had a force of 9 Ironclads. 7 of them were Passaic-class Monitors. He went in with the USS New Ironsides, which I showed earlier. That was his flagship. He was positioned right in the center of the flotilla. And then the one that brought up the rear was called the USS Keokuk, and so that was a completely different design that was brought in from a different place. It just happened to be handy, so they decided to use it in the attack on Charleston Harbor. Another thing that Samuel Francis DuPont had pushed back up the food chain and knew that these were vulnerabilities of ironclads were that rope obstructions, which could be put across Charleston Harbor, were going to be something that could be detrimental. Not only could it hang up the ships, but it would foul the propellers. The propellers would get caught up. He also had word that sea mines had been placed in Charleston Harbor, so that's something that was another problem they had to think about in making this attack. So as the attack moved forward, the lead ironclad indeed got caught up in a rope obstruction in Charleston Harbor, which hung up the entire flotilla. The USS Weehawken pushed around, went forward, got up close to Fort Sumter, got within a couple of 100 yards of Fort Sumter, but that's the furthest any of these ships went. Another problem in all this, as mentioned earlier, is the U.S. Navy ships couldn't fire a heavy volume of fire. They couldn't fire fast as compared to the Confederate guns mounted against them. That in about 2 hours of combat, the Confederate forts of Charleston at Fort Sumter, Fort Moultrie, some of the other batteries around Charleston Harbor scored over 450 hits on the U.S. Navy ships. That in that same amount of time, the Navy ships only scored a little over 90 hits back on the Confederate forts. So you can see the difference in firepower and the volume of fire they can lay out. Also, within about 20 minutes, 7 of the 9 ironclads have been disabled in some way. So their propellers have been caught in rope obstructions, that they had taken direct hits on the turrets, which had pinned the turrets in place. Something had happened with all of these ships. So after 2 hours, Samuel Francis DuPont decided to pull the ships out and evaluate, to reevaluate, and then maybe go back in the next day. One of the things to note about this attack was this fellow, Robert Smalls, who was an escaped slave who stole a boat called the Planter in 1862, and because of his valor and that Samuel Francis DuPont liked him so much, he let him be the pilot on the USS Keokuk. He gave him the honor of piloting this boat, being the person to navigate it in Charleston Harbor during this attack. It's interesting to note, too, that the Keokuk is the only ship of the flotilla to actually sink. It sank the next day because of the damage it took from Confederate forts. But a notable thing to put out about the use of ironclads is that Robert Smalls, an escaped slave, was a pilot on one of the ships that went with him into this attack. Samuel Francis DuPont pulled together all of the commanders of these ironclad vessels to have a council of war. What do you think? What are the condition of your ships? They all said, our ships are not in good shape. There's no way we can go back into combat. So Samuel Francis DuPont decided not to renew the attack, that to renew the attack would be to convert failure into disaster. He did not want to see any of these ships sunk and then captured by the Confederates, and that way they would get the technology, monitor technology, and not only that, but the guns that were inside the turrets. He didn't want to see any of his ships sunk or any of his people hurt. So he decided to pull his ships back a little further out in the Charleston Harbor and resume the blockade of Charleston Harbor and await orders and see what would happen next. Hunky-dory, right? But that's not the case. The Navy Department, again Gustavus Fox and Gideon Wells, were unhappy that this attack didn't move forward, that they really thought that these monitors, these Passaic-class monitors, the ironclad vessels, were going to be the magic bullet that the United States Navy could use to destroy the defenses of Charleston. They thought they were going to be able to sail right into Charleston Harbor, blow the place apart, and tremendous victory for the U.S. Navy. That they immediately wanted to find out what went wrong. So accusations started flying back and forth, particularly among some of the engineering officers assigned to the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, that their reports back to the Navy Department were like, no, these line commanders are wrong. We could have gone right back into combat the next day. That they didn't use them right, all these arguments from the engineers. And then on the other side of this, the line officers were saying, no, there's no way we could have done this, that operationally this is going to be difficult, plus the crews were having a hard time. And don't forget, too, as far as the crews are concerned, these were terrible vessels to serve in because they were below water most of the time. They stank. You have coal dust going everywhere, oil, the tremendous heat from the steam engines. You know, again, you're below water, that there's mold growing on things. They're not fun ships to serve on. So these guys, especially in being in combat and taking hits, they're like, no, you know, this is not something that we want to do. So there's a lot of arguments back and forth over who was to blame in the failure in Charleston Harbor. Samuel Francis DuPont argued back that, I did the right thing, and much to his detriment, said to the Navy Department, if you think you've got somebody that can do it better than me, then send them on down. The Navy Department used that as the pretext for saying, well, you asked to be relieved of command, we are going to relieve you of command. So this ended up being the downfall of Samuel Francis DuPont's Navy career. After being in the Navy since 1815, this pretty much ended things for him. So he was to be relieved of command initially by Andrew Foote. He was one of the first people, along with Samuel Francis DuPont, to receive the rank of Rear-Admiral. Pretty important guy that he had used ironclads effectively on the Mississippi River and in operations with the Army in the Western Theater of Operations with people like U.S. Grant. But unfortunately, Andrew Foote died before he could reach the South Atlantic blockading squadron. So the person that eventually relieved Samuel Francis DuPont of command was John A. Dahlgren, himself a Rear Admiral, a favorite of Abraham Lincoln, and considered by many to be the aggressive go-getter that would be able to just go kick Charleston right open and do what timid Samuel Francis DuPont could not do. So he ended up relieving Samuel Francis DuPont of command on July 4th, 1863. But before Samuel Francis DuPont left, and this is an important part of the story, he had one last victory under his belt. So this was the capture of the Confederate ironclad Atlanta by the Passaic Monitor's USS Weehawken and USS Nahant on June 17, 1863. So this was just before Samuel Francis DuPont left command of the South Atlantic blockading squadron. They heard that this Confederate ironclad was operating just outside of Savannah, Georgia, and so sent the Weehawken and Nahant to track it down and take it out if they could. This combat only lasted about 10 minutes, that these powerful Dahlgren guns were able to punch through the armor of the CSS Atlanta. So the Weehawken fired 2 shots, both of them were hits, and ended up killing about 30 people inside the Atlanta. The Atlanta lost control, ran aground, and immediately surrendered. The crew of the USS Nahant were upset because they didn't get to fire a single shot in this action. But it was the last hurrah for Samuel Francis DuPont, and ended up helping prove some points for him later in arguments that he would have with the Navy Department over the use of ironclad vessels in combat. So in July 1863, he returned to Delaware. This is he and his wife, Sophie, on the porch of their house called Louvier, Upper Louvier, which was here in Wilmington, Delaware, just across from Hagley, across the Brandywine River from Hagley. He came home and licked his wounds, so to speak, that he was unhappy about everything that had happened. He wanted to be vindicated. In the wider world, popular opinion was kind of on his side. It was just another failed attack. That in the grand scheme of things during the American Civil War, a lot of people attacked and failed. You had a lot of famous generals, Navy people that didn't do so well, went into combat, so what? It's just the fortunes of war, that tomorrow is another day, keep moving. The image that you see here is one of my favorite things from Samuel Francis DuPont's papers. This is a drawing that was done of a reporter from the New York Times that went with Samuel Francis DuPont's flotilla on their attack in April of April 1863. And the caption reads, "Trial Trip of the Naval Ironclad Reporter from the New York Herald." Sorry, New York Herald, not New York Times. So this was kind of lampooned in a lot of ways, that this was so new and novel, and kind of an interesting deal that they would draw these political cartoons and other cartoons to put out about this attack. So again, the court of popular opinion was on Samuel Francis DuPont's side. It's like, another attack, so what? But some people, including Samuel Francis DuPont, didn't want to let it go. He got into tremendous arguments with the Navy Department, which sparked congressional hearings over the conduct of the war. There were several hearings over the conduct of the war that happened throughout the war, but one specifically for use of ironclad vessels and Navy operations in the South Atlantic blockading squadron, and these lasted from 1863 to 1864. One of the main people involved is the guy pictured, Alban Steimers, who was a Navy engineer. He was one of the lead engineers with the U.S. Navy. He was assigned to Samuel Francis DuPont's flotilla that made the attack in April 1863. He reported back to the Navy Department that Admiral DuPont had done everything wrong, that he half-heartedly went in, he just didn't have the stomach for the attack, didn't know how to use his ships. Alvin Steinmers ended up becoming a pretty outspoken critic of Admiral DuPont over all of the actions that he used the ironclad vessels in, and of all of his Navy actions in general. So back to this argument of line officers versus engineering officers, this is a big thing for the Civil War Navy and the Navy in mid-19th century. What's interesting, too, to point out about Alvin Steinmers is that he had helped John Erickson with the Monitor designs and ended up taking the designs a little further, so he designed a class of Monitor-type vessels beyond the Passaic class, which ended up not floating at all, that they were so poorly designed that whenever they sent them down the ways to be launched, they sank right to the bottom of the river or the waterway that they were in, costing the Navy Department a lot of money and a lot of bad publicity in Congress. That the failure of some of the ships that Alvin Steinmers designed ended up making Congress reluctant for most of the rest of the 19th century to appropriate funds for new and novel ships. So that's a part of the long history of these arguments, that Alvin Steinmers himself, though he was considered a credible witness early on, ended up being kind of cast out, that he resigned from the Navy in 1865 and went on to a private consulting practice and other work in the maritime field. But something to think about in the longer history of all this. So Admiral DuPont made a case about ironclad vessels, and he made a couple of conclusions, and this is how he argued his points with the Navy Department and before Congress, that there were things that these vessels were good for and things that they were bad for. The things that they were good for were ship-to-ship action, so either against wood-hulled vessels or other iron-hulled vessels. So use the example of the Weehawken and Nahant versus the CSS Atlanta, the Monitor and the Virginia, other actions where they were against ships. They were great for brown water actions, meaning blockading and patrol, that they didn't sit low in the water, meaning you can get them close up rivers, you can get them close into places to conduct blockades, do a lot of patrol work. They're also a great deterrent because blockade runners knew that they couldn't hold up against these ships, that although one Monitor could not outrun a blockade runner, if you had a group of them waiting for a blockade runner that concentrating their fire, they could corner one and take it out pretty easily. Things that they were terrible for were attacking fortified positions on land, that you couldn't elevate the guns in these turrets enough to really shoot. You couldn't keep enough of a volume of fire, as was proved against Fort McAllister, against the attack on Charleston, and at other places during the Civil War. You couldn't use them in blue water actions, meaning you couldn't get them out to sea. You couldn't send them out against other large ships or too far away from land. And you couldn't use them for long-distance cruising because the engines were inefficient. They didn't have a large coal capacity. So you have good and bad. And part of his argument with the Navy Department was that you need to think about strategically how to use these vessels, that you can use them, you should use them for the things that they're good for, not use them for the things that they're bad for. Use different ships for different purposes, which is something the Navy had always thought about and would think about again for all the way up until now. But you had to think about that even more specifically about these, that although they were a technological innovation, they weren't going to be a magic bullet, and that was something to keep in mind. In making the case with the Navy Department, Samuel Francis DuPont hired this guy, Xanthus Russell Smith, to come to the Brandywine and help work on his defense. Xanthus Smith was from the Smith family of painters from Philadelphia and went on himself to become a pretty famous painter, doing marinescapes, seascapes, painting naval actions of the American Civil War. Xanthus Smith had been on Samuel Francis DuPont's staff in the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, so someone who was known to Samuel Francis DuPont. So Xanthus Smith copied correspondence, but because he was an artist, did some fantastic drawings, which Samuel Francis DuPont could take to the Navy Department and take to Congress to try to make the point, to argue his case. So the drawing you see here is of sea mines, as they called them in that period, torpedoes, which were around Georgia and Charleston Harbor, to help talk about why just charging into Confederate positions late in the war was not that good of an idea. So this drawing was to help make that point of how formidable of a defense weapon torpedoes, mines, could be. Xanthus Smith also helped illustrate the danger from forts, and I know this may be a little light to see on your screen, but this is a cross-section of forts that were in Charleston Harbor to show how thick they were, how big they were, that it wasn't going to be easy for these Navy ships, these ironclads, with a limited amount of firepower to bust through these forts. So you've got these really nice drawings that Xantha Smith did to help make that point, to show what a formidable thing these fortifications were. He also did drawings of some of the ironclads that the Confederates were putting into service. This one is called the Merrimack Number 2, which is one the Confederates designed but never actually built. But the idea being to show how these things were made and to show that ships like these Monitors were viable against ironclads, but not necessarily against some of the forts that were in and around Charleston Harbor and other places. Samuel Francis DuPont ended up not really winning or not really losing, that in the court of public opinion, he still remained a naval hero, but according to the Navy Department, that was it. That pretty much ended his career, and a lot of people in Congress didn't see him as being an effective commander from that point on because of a lot of these arguments that he had made, that he ended up being relegated to just being on evaluation boards. They didn't kick him out of the Navy, but he never held another command. A lot of people advised him not to make this argument with the Navy Department. They said, just keep your mouth shut and you'll get another command and that'll be that. But he wanted to prove the point and push this thing through. And although he made a good defense, it was hard to push against a lot of interests that were in Congress and the Navy Department in that period to make this point that John Erickson, who designed the Monitors, had enough defenders, that Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, had enough powerful influence that they were able to effectively counter and neutralize Samuel Francis DuPont. But in the end, his replacement wasn't able to do any better. That Samuel Francis DuPont had partial vindication in that John Dahlgren couldn't capture Charleston with ironclads. That the Navy said, well, Dahlgren is a go-getter, let him charge in. The image you see at top is of the USS Weehawk and the USS Montauk and the USS New Ironsides firing against Fort Moultrie in Charleston Harbor. That despite many tries, Dahlgren just could not capture Charleston Harbor with an all-ironclad force, and he most certainly tried several times. That in the end, he ended up just having to use them as a blockading force, and effectively used them as a blockading force as Samuel Francis DuPont had done before him. Charleston itself was not captured until February 1865, and that was not because of the Navy, it was because of William T. Sherman marching from Georgia back up through the Carolinas. So a large federal army behind Charleston, in addition to pressure from the Navy and other Army forces on the seaside, ended up being what made Charleston fall. So whenever Army and Navy forces got into Charleston, they saw that things like these sea mines and rope obstructions and proper aiming of guns and the heavy fortifications were as Samuel Francis DuPont's intelligence said they were. So he ended up being right in the end. So partial vindication for Samuel Francis DuPont. His vindication, though, didn't happen within his own lifetime. That he died on June 23rd, 1865, before he could open the case again or really push anything forward. So his wife Sophie is the one who carried on his case, that she wanted to rehabilitate her husband's reputation. So she wrote to everybody that knew him, had any kind of interaction with him, a lot of his junior commanders, to get them to send his correspondence to her, send copies of his correspondence to her. So she ended up amassing somewhere in the neighborhood of 38,000 items, which are at Hagley today. So that's what is in Samuel Francis DuPont's papers, are a lot of the things that she pulled together to help rehabilitate his reputation and vindicate him in the end. So in the end, it didn't happen in his lifetime. It came much after. And where we'll end today is that his vindication came by the thanks of Congress in 1884. Notice that that's almost 20 years after the Civil War ended, that it took that long for Congress to officially give him a vote of thanks for his service. And that's when they created DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., and created the statue, which was originally at DuPont Circle and now stands in Rockford Park here in Wilmington, Delaware. So this is the long, arduous journey of ironclad vessels under the service of Samuel Francis DuPont. So let's take a moment, and if any of you have any questions about this, any comments, we'll see what comes up in the comments section. And I know I'd had a little bit of trouble of getting comments last week to pop up. So if I don't see any pop up, what you can do is send me. You can type in a question in the comments section, and I'll answer it after we go off the live stream today. Or you're welcome to go to our standardized forum, which is Ask Hagley at hagley.org. You can go there, type in a question, they'll cycle that over to me, and I'll be able to answer questions. Or you can send me a direct message through the Lucas R. Clawson Hagley Historian Facebook page, or you can send it in through Hagley Museum and Library's Facebook page. So let's see. I'm not seeing that any of them are coming in here. Let me use a different method here and use the modern technology of my telephone to see if we're getting any comments coming in here that I can answer for you as we're online here today. Bear with me just a second while I pull this up. Okay, let me get a couple of questions here that I've seen pop up. Use my telephone here. One of the comments is from Chris. I've seen pictures of monitors in use in 1898. So despite their flaws, they were in use a long time. Yeah, they actually were. That they were called. Some of them were called back into service during the Spanish-American War to guard the American coast. That they weren't considered terribly serviceable during that point, but they were better than nothing. That the U.S. Army Navy realized a lot of vulnerabilities in 1898. That the U.S. coast was pretty susceptible to attack, and so pulled a lot of these obsolete ships back into service. That many of them weren't scrapped until after the Spanish-American War in 1898. The last one was the USS Canonicus, which was at the Jamestown Exposition in 1907, and survived all the way up until I think around 1908. So they were around. A bunch of them were around well into the 20th century. A question here from Sean: where were the Passaic class ships made? They were made all over the place. That part of trying to get these ships into service quickly was to spread out, making them at different yards. So some were made in New York, Philadelphia. Two were made in Wilmington, Delaware. That they were again made all over the place, just wherever places had capacity to be able to deal with ironwork on that scale and build hulls to those specifications. Another one comment from Sean: that almost sounds like Alvin Steinmers had a personal grudge against DuPont. He did, because both felt that their professional reputations had been attacked because of all that was going on. That this is again part of a larger argument between engineering officers and line officers that wouldn't get resolved until a little later. And part of the grudge came that engineering officers in that period didn't qualify for command. That you could not command a vessel if you were an engineering officer or command a Navy yard. That you were considered more or less like an advisor, a technical person, and not anyone who could have any sort of position of command or importance. But that's a longer picture story for the U.S. Navy. And a question here from Craig: is it true that the Monitor, new Ironsides, and the submarine Alligator were a three-pronged effort to destroy the Merrimack? That there was a lot of thought put into how you neutralize Confederate ironclads. That the Alligator, the ship referred to, was a kind of a submarine type of a vessel that the U.S. Navy put into operation. That the Civil War is the first operational use of a submarine type vessel. That the Alligators weren't completely submersible like the Confederate H.L. Hunley was, which was lost in its first and only attack in Charleston Harbor in 1864. But that was part of the idea, yes, of these ironclads and some of this technology, was to be able to neutralize not only the Merrimack, but other Confederate ironclads that were put into service. That they were a thorn in the U.S. Navy's side throughout the American Civil War. That the only way they were able to effectively neutralize them was just by heavy use of ironclad vessels like the Passaic class ironclads in the blockading areas and then to try to actively go after these ships and take them out like they did with the CSS Atlanta. And final question we'll take today. Do you believe, from John, do you believe that the limited powder charge restrictions caused by the Princeton gun explosion incident had any effect on the limited ability for the ironclad naval guns to penetrate masonry fort walls? No, that's not really anything that came into play during the American Civil War. It had more to do not with limited powder charges, because the Dahlgren guns had been proved really effective, as had the Parrott rifles, which were the two main ones the Navy put into service. Also, siege mortars that the Army put into service, and some of the other guns, the Columbiad type guns, were all pretty effective. The biggest thing that inhibited these guns against masonry forts was with rifle guns. They found that the rifle projectiles, because they had such high velocity, would burrow in and not make a lot of damage. The smoothbores could do a lot of crushing. That Samuel Francis DuPont was part of the capture of Fort Pulaski in Georgia, and this was an operation conducted by Quincy Gilmore of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. That they figured out that the best way to reduce a masonry fort was to use a combination of both. So you use a rifle gun to poke a hole, and then you use smoothbores to crush out around the hole that you made with a rifle. And so in combination, they worked really well. That they were able to reduce Fort Pulaski, a corner of Fort Pulaski, in a little over 24 hours, and they thought it was going to take months to be able to take out that fort. So when you get to Charleston Harbor, one of the problems there is that the Navy, the Army had bombarded just the crap out of those forts, and they had all crushed and crumbled down in on themselves, so they were more or less earth forts. Then that changes the game a little bit, because when you're shooting at masonry, you can blow it apart. Often with the earth forts, the projectile, smoothbore or rifle, it just absorbs it. So like against Fort Fisher in North Carolina in December 1864, January 1865, the Navy couldn't effectively take it out. It had to be a combined land and sea operation, with the Navy just bombarding away while the Army pushed in on the fort, because that fort took two of the largest naval bombardments in the Western Hemisphere up to that point, and it didn't subdue the fort. So there's a lot of factors that go into that, but back to the question here, it wasn't really about the powder charge so much as it's just the limits technologically of what it is you're using and what it is you're shooting at. Well, if there's any more questions, please type them again. I'll come back and answer them in the comments section, or send an email. Please check out our website, www.hagley.org, to learn more about what we're doing, to see about upcoming events. That's where our Hagley from Home initiative, a lot of videos, educational stuff that's up there for all the kids at home and adults too. You'll find that there. Also, if you want to learn more information, see more stuff that's in our collections about Samuel Francis DuPont and the Civil War, go to our digital archives at digital.hagley.org. There's a specific section within the digital archives on the American Civil War, and lots of lovely images of Samuel Francis DuPont, the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, and some of the stuff that we've talked about this week and last week. Also, be sure to check out Hagley's Facebook page to see events and other things coming up, and also notices of the live streams that I'm doing. So everyone, thank you for joining in today. I hope you have a lovely week, and we will see you back here again next week, next Friday at 10 a.m. for another Live with the Hagley Historian. Take care, everyone.